Okay, are you ready to look into Daniel 11 some more?
Amen.
Praise the Lord. Well, we have a number of verses to look at again tonight. We're moving right along in this section. We're going to try to look at verses 25 through 28. Daniel 11, 25 through 28. Let's see. I think I've given you before this little outline, and then I want to give it to you again and kind of explain some things about it because we're entering into this territory now. I think I've given this to you before. We're talking about from verse 21 through verse 35, the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. Then I'd broken that up into three sections, three real broad sections, where we said verses 21 through 24, Daniel 11, 21 through 24, were introduction. And we've already covered those verses now. And then verses 25 through 27 dealt with Egypt. And then verses 28 through 35 dealt with Israel. Now, get that down if you can, and then open your Bible and let's look at that. Last time we were kind of pushed towards the end of the class for enough time to study everything the way I wanted to. So we're going to hopefully have a little time to come back and look at the parallels again tonight between Daniel 11 and the first two books of Maccabees. I think you wrote all of that down, those outlines, but you didn't really have time to absorb the material, to go back and forth between Daniel 11 and the two books of Maccabees to get yourself acclimated to how these two correspond. And I guess the same is true with this little outline I've just given you in Daniel 11. You've probably written it down before, but maybe really not looked at it. He's introduced in his estate, in the estate of his brother Seleucus IV. Antiochus Epiphanes comes on the scene, verse 21. And then we divided the material between the 24th and 25th verse, simply because for the first time the king of the south, first time in this section of Epiphanes, the king of the south is mentioned by his designation. Verse 25, he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south. You see that. So that introduces us evidently to his attacks upon Egypt. However, see what I'm going to show you is there's a little overlapping between the first and the second section, and then between the second and the third. Because I think we already talked last time when we studied verses 22 through 24 that maybe some of this, such as this league in verse 23, maybe some of this has to do with the king of the south as well. This was the resumed promise that Cilicia and Palestine would be given over to the king of the south, as had the father of Epiphanes, Antiochus the Great, promised. For instance, back in verse 17, as a dowry along with Cleopatra. So what I'm saying is, if that's true, then this outline is just given for practical purposes, because we could say that his affairs with Egypt would start way back up in verse 23. You understand what I'm saying? Okay, then we said that the section proper dealing with Egypt would go from verse 25 through verse 27. Why do we stop there? Well, because in verse 28, we pick up a reference, his heart shall be against the holy covenant. And from that point on down through verse 35, you see many references to the people of God in Israel, which means that he's dealing with Israel. However, verse 29, right up in that section, says he's going to attack the south again. Well, we're back to Egypt again. So there's a little overlapping. So I've given it to you with those three steps. Let me give it to you again now. Verses 21 through 24 are introduction. You've already got that. But then with each of these other cases, we're going to reach back earlier into the material and show you how it's overlapping. Then Egypt would be dealt with from verse 23 through verse 30. See, 21 to 24 is introduction, but then 23 to 30 deals with Egypt. So in other words, we've gone back 2 verses earlier, and we're going a couple of verses, 3 verses later. And then the section dealing with Israel would be from, as you already have, verse 28 through 35. So that expands this middle section of this short practical outline dealing with Egypt. It really has to, because Egypt is dealt with earlier and Egypt is dealt with later than just the initial verses I've given you, the 3 verses of 25, 26, and 27. Okay, let's look at our topic tonight, Epiphanes' first invasion of Egypt. He may have had some skirmishes earlier. One writer suggests as many as 4 battles. Maybe the first 2 were skirmishes. We really don't know that. But we know the first invasion of Egypt proper takes place beginning in verse 25 and extending all the way through verse 28. So this is one whole section in itself. Now maybe you can understand, if you're following all of what I'm saying tonight, maybe you can understand why I began tonight re-giving you this outline again. Otherwise, if you were thinking at all, you'd think, well, the section dealing with Egypt is just verses 25 to 27. And I'm saying that the first section that deals with the first invasion of Egypt is from verse 25 down through, not just 2, but through verse 28, which would throw you off according to what we've given you before, but not according to how we've revised it this evening. So verses 25 through 28 contain the account of Epiphanes' first invasion of Egypt, as well as a few related things which happen immediately afterwards, particularly on his return trip home to Syria. Therefore, we'll look at verse 25, 26, 27, 28 tonight, and then hopefully we'll have enough time left to go back into Maccabees and go back into our outline, and hopefully you've got the outline with you that I gave you last time, and rather than having to write so much this time, although I think I'll give you dates now that'll correspond with that, then you can open your Apocrypha and follow along. Because for this section, 21 through 35, or really it goes back earlier, but basically the reign of Epiphanes from 21 to 35, much parallel information is given over in the book of Maccabees, the books of Maccabees. It's very, very helpful not just to know that, as everyone here does. You say, well, we've been told that many times. But really to know what portion of the books of Maccabees correspond with what portion of Daniel chapter 11. Then whenever you study one, you can study the other along with it, and you'll understand a lot better what's going on than just saying, well, I know it's real important. You see, it's easy to get a little doctrine. You just got to know the books of Maccabees to know Daniel 11. But then you fail to ever go home and really study the books of Maccabees then. So it does you no good to go around telling everyone else that if you don't know something yourself that applies in this area. Okay, let's read the section in its entirety, and then we'll come back and break it up into 4 verses. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south, Antiochus the fourth, Epiphanes against Ptolemy the sixth Philometor, uncle and nephew here, with a great army, and the king of the south, Ptolemy the sixth Philometor, shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief. They shall speak lies at one table. But it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Then shall he return into his own land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. And he shall do exploits and return to his own land. Okay, back to verse 25. Let's just kind of set the scene here. I think I also said last time that verses 21 through 24 cover the years approximately 175 to 170, somewhere on that order. 175 down to 170, verses 21 through 24. So, unless we're skipping some period of time, which we aren't, that would mean verse 25 would date around 170, would it not? And it does. this entire first battle and first invasion of Egypt, which has several aspects to it, from verse 25 through verse 28, dates around 170 BC. The people involved: Antiochus IV Epiphanes, son of Antiochus the Great, invades Egypt, which is controlled by his sister's first son, which makes him his nephew, Ptolemy the sixth Philometor, a lover of his mother. Ptolemy the sixth Philometor, who, according to your chart, rules from around 181 down to around 170. Now we're going to have to explain a little bit of this on the chart. You see along this line, you've got Cleopatra, his mother. She's the mother of Ptolemy the sixth Philometor, and Ptolemy the seventh, Ergetes as well. Then if you keep extending from Physcon or Ergetes II, you get down to a Cleopatra II, another queen, another woman by the name Cleopatra. We'll explain in a moment. But if you go back to around 170, you see how this parallel line juts up above Ptolemy VII. We have no reference then to Ptolemy VI, only to Queen Cleopatra II, which is not the first Cleopatra mentioned under the name Ptolemy VI, but the second one mentioned after the name of Ptolemy VII. You see all that, how the line juts upwardly? Okay, we'll explain that, what's going on there. That's significant with what's going to take place here in this battle. Okay, back to verse 25 then. He, Epiphanes, will stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south, Philometor, with a great army. Now, apparently this had been done, this war, this battle, they're being fought over this doubly broken promise of surrendering Cilicia and Palestine to the kings of the south, according to verse 17, and evidently according to verse 23. The former of those taking place during the reign of Antiochus the Great, and the latter of those taking place during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. Back to verse 17, remember that whenever Antiochus the Great marries off his daughter Cleopatra to Ptolemy V, the king of the south, the king of the north marrying his daughter off to the king of the south, there was a promise, a broken promise, but a promise of a dowry with Cleopatra. She's the daughter of women, remember of verse 17. The promise was the ceding over to Egypt of two provinces, Cilicia, Coele-Syria, Cilicia, and Palestine. Well, this was promised, but it was never given. We suggested last time, and it's merely a suggestion, that in the 23rd verse, Antiochus the Great is dead, Epiphanes, his son, is on the scene. This word league, L-E-A-G-U-E, this word league refers to perhaps a renewal of this promise, now by the son of the one who had made the original promise, where Epiphanes now is promising Philometor that he's going to cede to him and to the Egyptian government the provinces of Cilicia and Palestine. But it says after the league made with him, he will work deceitfully. So if our suggestion is true, it means his promise not only has been given twice, but broken twice as well. And it seems to be the case that the initiator of the first invasion of Egypt is not the king of the north, but the king of the south, according to verse 25. The king of the south is the one of the two who has the greater of the armies involved, as we'll see when we read the end of the verse here in a moment. And so what I'm saying is evidently he stirs something up. Ptolemy the sixth Philometor stirs something up because his promise has been broken twice of actually giving over. The promise has been made, but it's never been fulfilled yet. The actual giving over of the provinces of Cilicia and Palestine. They've never been given over yet by the king of the north and the king of the south. And so apparently this is true, the king of the south makes some type of advance toward the king of the north, And this incites him to have his power and his courage stirred up, according to the first part of verse 25. Therefore he comes with this great army. Before, remember, it said that he just had a small army. He'd become strong, verse 23, with a small people. That's because he, first of all, had to take the fattest places, verse 24, and practice socialism, remember, and redistribute the wealth to gain the favor of all of Syria to gain a larger army. So through all of that, verse 24, we've gone from the small people of verse 23 to verse 25. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army. Earlier it was just a small people, now with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great army. Now if one's great and one's very great, that means the latter of the two is larger. With a very great and mighty army. But he shall not stand. Which one is the he? Well, history tells us, and you can kind of tell from the text, it's the king of the south who fails in this battle. He shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Just speaking of the various military adventures by different parts of the troops of Epiphanes into Egypt. And so in 170, we have the battle fought at Pelusium, P-E-L-U-S-I-U-M, Pelusium, P-E-L-U-S-I-U-M, which is about the only thing we'd need a map on the overhead for, so I don't think I'll take the time to do that, but you can flip to the back of your Bible. I doubt it will be mentioned back there, but Pelusium was an Egyptian city just east of the Nile Delta, which would put it right in the vicinity of where present-day Suez Canal is. If you look for a map of Egypt, you know where the Suez Canal is today. Won't be on your map back then in David's day. But you can see approximately where the Suez Canal is today. And maybe just a little bit one direction or the other, we're not for sure, of the Suez Canal would be the ancient Egyptian city of Pelusium. Therefore, you really should have another reference here on your chart. I've got one written in. They kind of intend for that to be included in this general reference. If you read sideways on your chart, right underneath 175 BC, Antiochus IV's name, you see 175 to 168 campaigns of Antiochus against Egypt. Well, that's just in general. They don't tell us how many or when they're taking place or where they're taking place. So if you move down to around 170, you could jot in another notation there, 170, the Battle of Pelusium, because a lot is going to happen from this. And that 170 should correspond with that little upward mark on the line we talked about earlier that goes from Ptolemy VI up to Queen Cleopatra II. We've got a change in the government, you see. And this is all taking place on the basis of the Battle of Pelusium. And also, you see, for the first time, we have double lines now for the kingdom in Egypt. You've got Cleopatra II up above, and you've got Ptolemy VII underneath her. You've got two lines there. So you have to understand what's going on. So that vertical line in front of the name Ptolemy VII, that little tiny vertical slash, that dates 170. Just go right underneath that, and you'll get 170. You can jot that down for the Battle of Pelusium. Okay, so we understand what's taking place, the Battle of Pelusium, when it's taking place, 170, where it's taking place, east of the Nile River Delta. And we're understanding what happened, because the king of the south has lost. Now let's go from there then into the 26th verse. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. Verse 26. Okay, this is an explanation of why he lost. One reason, not the only reason, but one reason why he lost. Evidently he had some traitors. Some of his most trusted men practiced treachery against him. They that feed of the portion of his meat, Ptolemy Philometor, his own trusted advisors and counselors, shall destroy him. History hasn't preserved who they were or what they did, but it makes a lot of sense. Treachery normally is what goes on in governments back then. So he has evidently a few of his men, his trusted men, counselors, advisors, maybe military leaders or generals, who were close to him, expressed in this Oriental term, they fed with a portion of his meat, would actually turn out to be traitors against him. And his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And if I can remember later on, we'll look at a verse. We're going to look at several in the Apocrypha. In 1 Maccabees 1, like verse 19, something like that, that actually says the very same thing. Many will fall down slain. It's talking about the exact same battle here. And we'll come back and look at that in a moment. What we're not told here in the account of Daniel, but what we are told in history is that, but I guess you have it on your chart, kind of semi-implied on your chart. Notice Ptolemy VI vanishes. You've got Queen Cleopatra II, you've got Ptolemy VII, but where's Ptolemy VI? He's not even mentioned. He doesn't die in battle, but he's taken captive by his uncle. Remember, his uncle is Antiochus Epiphanes. Bodily, he is actually taken captive, the Battle of Pelusium. And I guess you could say that's intimated in the first part of verse 27. So we'll come to verse 27. To me, it almost seems more than intimated because of the way it expresses it here. But it doesn't, in other words, come right out. This is what I meant earlier in saying it's not covered here. It doesn't come right out and say, and the king of the south will be taken captive. But they're both eating at the same table. That's what we're going to see here in verse 27. The king of the north, the king of the south, are both eating at the same table. And we know who the victor is. It's the king of the north. So that must mean that the king of the south is now eating at the table of the king of the north, which must mean one's a captive of the other. Or either they're friends, and they're certainly not friends. One's the captive of the other. The nephew is the captive of the uncle. And both these kings, Antiochus IV and Ptolemy VI, both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table. Both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table. Okay, here's what happens that you need to have corresponding with this 27th verse. In the initial phase of this battle at Pelusium, in 170, Ptolemy VI loses, and he's taken captive by Antiochus. In 170, whenever he is taken captive, then the people in Alexandria install his brother, Ptolemy VII, as the new Egyptian Ptolemaic king in Alexandria. This is where he is seated on the throne. We know that much from history. Therefore, verse 27 would be, the first part of verse 27 would be a reference to the attempted plotting going on at the table of the king of the north between this uncle and his nephew. And remember, now he has another nephew who's on the throne down in Egypt. But between the king of the north and the former king of the south, as to how they can get rid of Ptolemy VII from now being king in Egypt and put Ptolemy VI back on the throne. Now if you say, well, that's kind of self-defeating there. You just conquered him. Why put him back on the throne? Because he appeared to be a lot easier to handle, put him on the throne as a puppet king, than to march back into Egypt and reconquer the nation and defeat this new king, Ptolemy VII, and then try to control Egypt through him. That proved to be much more difficult. As a matter of fact, verse 27 tells us that it proved to be impossible. That was something that couldn't be done. So when it says, these kings' hearts will do mischief, and they will speak lies at one table. They are plotting together, the uncle and the nephew, Epiphanes and Philometor, on how to get back into Egypt, wrest control away from another brother or another nephew, Ptolemy the Seventh, wrest control of Egypt away from him, and vested back in the older of the two brothers, Ptolemy Philometor. When it says that these kings' hearts will do mischief and they'll speak lies, what that means is, remember, Antiochus Epiphanes is basically a liar, but he's a flatterer, though. He works by guile and subtlety. And so here's the picture that the angel intends for us to understand. Epiphanes is promising his nephew, if you'll just work with me, with the troops that are still faithful to you, if you'll just work with me, we'll get control of Egypt again, and I'll let you be king. The whole time he's thinking, this uncle of mine's lying to me. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pretend like I'll go along with him and say, yes, I'll go along with you, and then I'll let you be the great king, and I'll be the under king under you. But the whole time he's thinking, no, once I get back down there, I'm going to take total control of Egypt and expel this uncle of mine, Epiphanes, out. Which is a colorful addition to what's going on. They're both sitting at a table speaking lies to one another. That's a good definition of what diplomacy is. Diplomacy is when two people sit down at a table, look each other in the face, and lie to one another. That is the typical my definition of what diplomacy is. That's what goes on. Two people sit down at a table, look at one another, smile, they're courteous, and they lie to one another. And the whole time, each of them knows the other's lying to you. But you got to do it anyway. That's just part of protocol, etiquette. That's just part of the formalities. Sit down, smile, drink some of your water, and just lie up a storm. The other one just says, that's right, and then here's my proposal, and he just lies up a storm. And so this is what's going on here. Not only do we have an early case of socialism, but of good old diplomacy as well. Sit at the same table and lie to one another, but smile and shake hands afterwards. You see it in the newspaper all the time. Because it takes place all the time. Well, anyway, that's what's going on. But we're told here, it shall not prosper. You just don't prosper lying like this. For yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Attempted explanation of that final phrase, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. What their proposal is in the beginning of this verse is to unite the two empires, north and south, thus squashing any rebellion or any animosity between the two, and therefore it would present Israel no longer with this problem of being between these two warring nations. But yet it's not God's time for it to come to an end yet. The wars between the two, and therefore the wars through the land and over the people of Israel. So we have this phrase, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. They will not prosper because the end, some final alliance between these two people, it's not time for that yet. It'll come at the time appointed, which is a reference to the time appointed, of course, of God. The same thing, a reference to the time appointed of God, we've already seen in the end of verse 24, if you take a look there. Even for a time. He'll be successful even for a time. That doesn't just mean indefinitely. We don't know how long, because God knows how long, because he plans it that way. Now, one other comment before we move through this into verse 28, which introduces us to Israel. We have an interesting Oriental touch to the episode seen twice here, both in verses 26 and 27. Once described as meat, or really food it should be, and once described as table in verse 27. An Oriental touch, a touch of Orientalism. What do I mean by this? Well, the meal at which two people or parties would sit down to was one of the most sacred aspects of hospitality that an Oriental could possibly conceive of. Remember whenever, and thus the reference here to food, and thus the reference to sitting here at one table. And thus the heightened sense we're to gain of the treachery and the barbarous nature involved here, when that was one of the highest aspects of hospitality and social civility that the Orientals could manifest, invite someone to dinner. And so, what worse of a picture could you have to invite someone to dinner and to lie to them while they're eating with you, and for them to lie to you? So that's why they're picturing this over dinner, although they don't necessarily have to be sitting down over dinner. It's picturing the heightened sense of the treachery and the barbarous nature of this involved, because that's the one time you wouldn't lie to someone whenever you invite them over to dinner. And that's just a touch of Orientalism there. Remember whenever Abraham, back in Genesis 18, saw those three men, what did he do? Say, come in? No, he invited them in, but he invited them in to a dinner. And whenever you see people meeting and greeting one another like that, you see it in some of the parables in the Gospels. It's always meeting and greeting, but it's coming in to have a dinner as well. Remember, it's prophesied, and it was fulfilled as well in the Gospels, but it was prophesied in Psalm 41 and verse 10, was fulfilled in John 13:18. Jesus said, "He that hath eaten bread with me hath lifted up his heel against me." A prophecy of the desertion and the apostasy of Judas Iscariot. And so for a Jew, for an Oriental, that's the heightened sense of treachery. That's the heightened sense of betraying someone, to betray someone right over a meal. And remember that literally in John chapter 13, the chapter on the washing of the feet and the meal, that literally happened with Judas Iscariot right over the meal. Jesus said, "He that hath eaten bread with me hath lifted up his heel against me." I think the full reference in Psalm 51 calls him my familiar friend. He was an acquaintance with Christ, one of the 12 apostles. As a matter of fact, Jesus even gave him part of the sop, a morsel that was dipped in the sauce there. They wanted to know which one's going to betray you. And he said, "It's the one to whom I give this sop once it's been dipped in the sauce." And he gave it to Judas. And, Bible students from that time have wondered, well, why didn't they just say, well, okay, here's the one that's going to betray? Because you could never betray someone over a meal like that, and particularly not when the host, who was Jesus, actually gave you the first morsel to eat. Showed that you were a close friend of his. They couldn't conceive of the fact that Judas would go out and actually betray him. It also shows the love that Jesus still had for Judas Iscariot as a human being. To give him the first morsel of the bread dipped in the sauce is the highest compliment you could pay someone, as far as the Orientals were concerned. So having painted all that background, now you understand the treachery involved here. That's why it mentions verse 26, "Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat." Now this is referring, remember, to those who betrayed, first of all, Ptolemy Philometor. Those that feed of the portion of his meat will destroy or really betray him. It's the worst thing you can do. And then another case, but it's the same idea involved. It's just another case. Verse 27, "Both of these kings' hearts shall do mischief. They shall speak lies at one table." At one table. We're to get the picture of them literally sitting down. This is a picture we're to get of them literally sitting down and having a meal in the common Oriental fashion of great, great hospitality, and then lying through it all. Okay, verse 28. "Then shall he return into his land," Antiochus Epiphanes, "with great riches," which he does. He was successful in conquering Egypt. "And his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land." Just a little repetitive there, but to get the point across that he shall return to his own land. Okay, all of this is happening around 170, 169, somewhere in this period of time. We don't know how long he's in Egypt, how long some of these events are taking place. But before fully getting into verse 28, we see that he is at least preparing now to head home. Let's go back and deal with this case on our chart here. What's happening now with Ptolemy the Sixth, the two Cleopatras, and Ptolemy the Seventh? Remember, they've sat down at dinner together trying to get Ptolemy the Sixth back in as king. They both have ulterior motives for having him installed again as king. Well, they're only partially successful. Ptolemy the Sixth is installed as king in Egypt in the city of Memphis, and he only controls the city of Memphis. really the working out of the details ended up not taking place between Ptolemy the Sixth and Antiochus the Fourth, but between the two brothers, Ptolemy the Sixth and Ptolemy the Seventh, where Getes the Second, Ptolemy the Seventh, actually allowed his brother back in to assume control of Memphis, but Alexandria was the chief city of the empire of this day, and so the king who ruled there, and that king was Ptolemy the Seventh, was the official king of the country. And he marries, Ptolemy the Seventh, then marries their common sister, who had been produced by Ptolemy the Fifth, Epiphanes, and Cleopatra the First. And that, of course, would be the second Cleopatra the Second. So now you know something of what all of these people mean then. Queen Cleopatra the Second, she's put up on that line evidently by the author of this chart above Ptolemy the Seventh, because whenever Ptolemy the Seventh, he's the new king in Egypt, remember. Whenever he marries her, that more or less disposes of their mother, Cleopatra the First, who had been the queen mother prior to this time. So Cleopatra the Second and Ptolemy the Seventh, they're not once removed or cousins or something. They are literal brother and sister. And Cleopatra the Second also, that would mean that she also would be the sister of Ptolemy the Sixth. We've already explained the names, Epiphanes, Philometor, Getes. We've seen that name before. Physcon, you see the name in parentheses? Means the gross one, or the bloated one, evidently because of his bodily feature. He was nicknamed by the Egyptians the gross one. I don't know if that meant he was fat or had some deformity or what, but you wouldn't have wanted to be Cleopatra the Second. We'll just put it that way. Married to someone called the bloated one. I guess I'd rather be called bloated than gross, though. But I don't know, I had a best friend whenever I was growing up, and his last name was Gross. And every time we'd say something, you know, how people always say, that's gross. He'd always say, don't use my name in vain. Everybody says, this is gross or that is gross. And he said, you're swearing by my name. Don't use my name in vain. Well, you have to understand something else to really understand that. We were non-Christians, but we were religious little boys, and we had this agreement that we could lie to each other about anything. And the only way we could determine whether the other one was lying. I mean, I can still, as I'm talking tonight, that was many years ago, but we were standing beside a fence, and I can still see the fence when we went through this little discussion. The only way we could tell if the other one was lying is say, do you swear to God that that's true? And for some reason, both of us had something in us, and we wouldn't swear to God about anything, and especially not about something that was wrong. And so we each knew for the other one that all you have to do is ask him, you swear to God? And we'd say, now let's don't talk about it anymore. And then that meant we were lying, of course. So swearing to God, somehow that involved taking God's name in vain. We understood that then. And then from there, you get to taking his name in vain. Well, anyway, the good friend, I don't know about his wife. Now she's Mrs. Gross then. No, she's the same one I've told you stories about that called me whenever I was down at Ole Miss. I picked up the phone. I think I've told you this before one time, and this girl said, you don't know me, but I know you. And I didn't have any girls calling on me, so it was a big surprise to find someone who knew me that I didn't know them. And she was engaged to be married to this friend of mine that I had lost track of years before. Now, I was down at Ole Miss, and she was down at Ole Miss. And we were studying the same astronomy class together. So I tried to get her converted and filled with the Spirit, but she had a Baptist upbringing. And whenever she was really interested in all of that until she went back home and talked to Mrs. Gross, this woman that lived behind us for years and years. And now they had moved somewhere into Mississippi, and we had moved somewhere else. Went and talked to her, and then went and talked to her mother, her own mother, and her fiance's mother. So don't fool around with those people that handle snakes and drink poison. We've heard a lot about them. So the next time she was back at school, that's what we talked about, snake handling and drinking poison. I never could get her convinced of the truth, though. Well, anyway, back, I think we were in verse 28. Just a little personal tidbits from all these things come flooding to your mind, you know. I can still see that fence. It was over at the Koneman's house across the street from us. Then shall he return into his land. We've already dealt with the chart. You can basically, I guess, put that up. Then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. Now we've seen once before a reference to the Berit, the covenant, with the prince of the covenant, the Sar of the Berit. And now we have the Kodesh Berit, the holy covenant here. So probably we're talking about, obviously, we're talking about the nation of Israel. And the heart of the king of the north is turned against the holy covenant on his way back to Syria from Egypt through Palestine. Why? Well, there appear to be two causes for this malevolence of the king of the north. The first place, his extreme disappointment over not being totally successful in subjugating all of Egypt to his rule. He's disappointed, so, you know, you take it out on the nearest people. And the nearest people would be the Jews, through whose land he's now passing. And secondly, and more importantly, and this is going to tie in to a lot that we have said before, I think it was last week we basically discussed this. We have a minor revolt on our hands in Jerusalem. A minor revolt by the Jews around 170, 169 BC. And he just happens to be passing through around the same time, and therefore he's going to put down this insurrection.
For the continuation of this message,
A minor revolt by the Jews around 170, 169 BC. And he just happens to be passing through around the same time, and therefore he's going to put down this insurrection. Why do we have the revolt? Because of the deeds of one Menelaus. Now, who was Menelaus? One of the high priests. And what was significant about his high priesthood? It brought to an end the Zadokian line. He was the spurious Benjamite that ended up being the high priest around 171, 170, I think your chart will say, BC. And so remember what brought that about. We started off with Onias III. Then he had a brother, Jason, who in 174, a year after Epiphanes had come to the throne in Syria, outbids his older brother Onias for the high priesthood. You remember that? And the king, he doesn't have any qualms on giving the high priesthood to anyone, whoever can pay the most for it. He has no religious scruples to him at all. So he gives the high priesthood to Jason in 174. Then Jason has either a brother or one of his top officials, about half the work she'll read, he's called another brother of Onias and Jason, and half of them will say that, as the Apocrypha does, that he was just a co-worker with Jason, that Menelaus sent when running an errand to the king for Jason, and he is a faithful minister under Jason, outbids Jason for the high priesthood. And so we've had this take place twice now. Once Jason taking it from Onias III, and once Menelaus taking it from Jason. So Menelaus is the high priest. Now Jason, was he a good, or Onias, was he a good priest or a bad priest? Good one. Onias III was a good, Orthodox Jewish high priest. What about Jason? Bad. What about Menelaus? Worse. Terrible one. So the Jews have had to go through one thing now, having Jason More Jews are Orthodox than non-Orthodox, by the way. There are more that are in Judaism than in Hellenism at this time. They've already had to go through one thing with Jason becoming high priest, who is a wicked high priest. But at least he's descended in the right line, though, from Aaron. Now to have Menelaus, it's almost more than they can handle. And to compound the matters, what does Menelaus do that outrages the people of Palestine? He has Onias III murdered, because Onias III denounces him for stealing some of the gold from the temple. We're going to look at those verses here in a moment. So this is the cause for the revolt, the minor Jewish revolt in Palestine, and this basically is the cause for what we have here in verse 28, his heart shall be against the holy covenant. I'll repeat anything if you stop me if I need to. So we find this recorded in 2 Maccabees. If you'll turn with me to 2 Maccabees 4, 23 through 26, and then 33 through 39. 2 Maccabees 4, 23 through 26, 33 through 39. through 39. And then we're going to need our Apocrypha a lot with the time we have left. 1st and 2nd Maccabees. 3 years later, Jason sent Menelaus, at this time Jason is high priest, Jason sent Menelaus, brother of the Simon mentioned before. Now the Simon mentioned before was the Benjamite that squealed on Onias to Heliodorus, and then Heliodorus told the king, Seleucus IV, who became king in 187 in the kingdom of the north, and Heliodorus, the tax collector, was sent to gather the treasures from the temple. So that's who this Simon is. And we're told that Menelaus was a brother of Simon, not of Onias or not of Jason. However, a lot of the writings, including Josephus, tell us that Jason, Onias, Menelaus were all brothers, and maybe that's true. Mentioned above to convey money to the king and carry out his directions about urgent business. But Menelaus established his position with the king and outbid Jason by 300 talents in silver, and so diverted the high priesthood to himself. He arrived back with the royal mandate, but with nothing else to make him worthy of the high priesthood. He still had the temper of a cruel tyrant and the fury of a savage beast. And Jason has to flee to the Ammonite territory, which you need to remember. That will become important maybe next week whenever we discuss some things taking place in 2 Maccabees 5. But Jason has to flee over to the Ammonite territory. Okay, that's how the high priesthood ends up in the hands of Menelaus. And now to see verse 33, what really outrages the people is his having Onias, the Orthodox Jewish high priest, murdered. When Onias heard this, heard what? The middle of verse 32, that some of the gold plates belonging to the temple were being given away. When Onias heard this on good authority, he withdrew to the sanctuary at Daphne near Antioch and denounced him, Menelaus. And as a result, Menelaus approached Andronicus, who was an envoy of King Epiphanes, privately, and urged him to kill Onias. The regent went to Onias bent on treachery. He greeted him, gave him assurances on oath, persuaded him, though still suspicious, to leave the sanctuary. Then at once, with no respect for justice, he made away with him. His murder filled not only Jews, but many from other nations as well with alarm and anger. Now the next few verses are a little suspect. Antiochus Epiphanes gets so touched by the death of Onias, he burst out crying. Well, if he ever cried, it was in guile and subtlety, according to Daniel 11. He never was sorry for anyone's death, and certainly not the Jewish high priest. So maybe the author of 2 Maccabees is kind of sprucing the original story up a little bit. But be that as it may, we're told anyway that Epiphanes has his own regent, Andronicus, killed, because Andronicus, under the orders or the suggestion of Menelaus, had killed Onias III. And so because now, first of all, the exaltation to the high priesthood of Menelaus and then the death of Onias, now the Jews are in an uproar. They're in an uproar, and this is what Daniel 11:28 is all about. This is why the king is one reason, and the chief reason why the king Epiphanes is wreaking havoc against the people of Israel. Now, let's see, do we have time? I suppose we do. One more thing I want to say before we go back to that outline. This installation of Menelaus as high priest in 171 has been suggested, and I'm not so sure of this. I think I would opt for the other view for several reasons, but has been suggested as the fulfillment of Daniel 11 verses 13 to 14. You'll turn over there really quickly with me. We need to do this quickly because it's really getting off the story. Daniel 11:13 to 14, or Daniel 8, Daniel 8:13 to 14. Here's what we have. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto him, that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision? That is, the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the one concerning the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot. And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Daniel 8:13 to 14. 2,300 days. So students of prophecy, jump into this and try to determine, are we talking about end-time events, these 2,300 days, or what? Well, most reliable people who have any sense at all know we're not talking about end-time events at all. We're talking about the period of Antiochus Epiphanes. But to know the beginning and the end of this period of 2,300 days is another matter. It's generally agreed upon that the end would be the cleansing of the temple under Judas Maccabeus in Kislev, around the middle of December in 165. Then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. That would be December 165 BC. So you'd think, well, it's just going to be easy. Just count backwards 2,300 days. Well, 2,300 days equals about 6 years and 3 months. A little bit over 6 years, quite a bit over. More like almost 6 years, 4 months, if you divide all that out. So subtract 6 years from December 165, and what do you have? December 171. And then subtract 3 more months. September 171. What's going on in 171 concerning the liturgy that's very important in Israel? The end of the Zadokian priesthood, with the exaltation of Menelaus to the position of being the high priest there. So, people like Leon Wood, suggest that's the proper interpretation of this passage. And that's the only reason I'm mentioning it now, because some people suggest this as the proper interpretation, and if that's true, it concerns Menelaus, and since we're talking about Menelaus, it'd be time to bring a passage like this in. However, there are several things that seem to militate against that, the chief of those being something that's grammatical. We don't have here, as you got in King James, the text, days, yamim, but we have erev boker. We have evening and morning. He said unto me, unto 2,300, and you'll see it in your margin, erev boker, as you already know, evening and morning, and not yamim, which is a plural of yom for days. Days is totally a mistranslation. For the King James translators, they understood an evening and a morning, erev boker, to be a yom, to be one day. And therefore, if you've got 2,300 of the evenings, then you've got 2,300 of the mornings, which means you have 2,300 days. But, if the text doesn't have, as it does in other places, Yom or Yamim, and it doesn't. You can look it up in your Hebrew Bible. If you have your Hebrew Bible with you, it'll have Er and Boker and not Yamim. If it doesn't have days, then it must have a reason behind giving evening morning specifically, and especially giving evening morning in the context of the sacrifice. What did we study not long ago in Christian ethics concerning prayer? That there was a morning sacrifice and an evening sacrifice, and there were prayers related to both of those. Therefore, if he said 2,300 Erev Boker, then he means you have to divide everything by 2 then. We're not talking about 2,300 days, we're talking about 1,150 days then, which is going to give an entirely different meaning, which is going to be a little over 3 years, like 3 years and a couple of months, right? If I calculate that correctly, like 3 years and a couple of months. Which then seems to be, hallelujah for Brother Rawls, he just rambles and rambles and rambles. But I get all excited and wrapped up in this. Which then, because I'm thinking of all these things in my mind, how this fits, some other passage, and you're just struggling to understand what I'm talking about. But remember, what happens in December 168 BC? That's when the temple is first polluted. Remember, it was exactly to the day, 3 years later, to the same day, December 15th or whatever of 165, that the temple is cleansed by Judas Maccabeus. So there's our 3 years right there. And it's talking about when the sanctuary is going to be cleansed. Nothing goes on concerning the sanctuary whenever Menelaus becomes high priest. But something does happen whenever Antiochus Epiphanes sets up the abomination that maketh desolate. Then we have a profanation of the sanctuary there. But you say that's 3 years. What about the extra couple of months? Well, for that we'd have to get into, and it's ahead of time right now, ahead of schedule, 2 Maccabees chapter 5, where we're going to see that on the second campaign of Epiphanes into Egypt, a rumor travels back to Palestine that he's killed in battle. Jason, meanwhile, who has been living over where? In Ammonite territory, hears this rumor, thinks this is a good time to go into Jerusalem and knock Menelaus off the throne of the high priesthood. And so he goes in, knocks him out, he's shut up in the citadel for a number of days, and with the high priest shut up in the citadel, then there is the possibility that that would have been a suspension of the daily sacrifice for at least a couple of weeks. It may have amounted to a couple of months prior to December 15th, 168 BC. So, thank the Lord for the tapes, as we always say. If that's true, then that would be a better interpretation of Daniel 11, 13 to 14. Okay, forget about that. Let's go on to something else real quickly here. I don't have the time or the energy to repeat all of that. Back to our books of Maccabees, quickly. Now, I want you to keep your books of Maccabees before you while we look at this, to kind of accustom you to where we're going to be in the Apocrypha. We're basically through tonight, but we do want to look at this again. Back to your outline that I gave you last time, starting with Daniel 11:3. Now that corresponds with 1 Maccabees 1, verses 1 to 4. You all have the same one, or I can briefly go over it when we come to each point. Daniel 11:3 corresponds with 1 Maccabees 1, verses 1 to 4. It's one thing if I just stand up here and talk, and I can't tell if everyone's really understanding what I'm talking about. So if we can go slowly enough, but quickly enough, then we can finish this. So you'll need to be turning to each of these passages of the text, Daniel 11 and books of Maccabees, to see what we're talking about, to get used to where we're going and how these books of Maccabees are set up. We gave you an outline of the 2 books last time. I'm not going to go over that again. 1 Maccabees covers a period of 40 years from the ascension of Epiphanes to the throne in 175, the time of John Hyrcanus in 135, 40 years. 2 Maccabees antedates 1 Maccabees by 5 years, back into the reign of Seleucus IV, who began reign in 187, the date of 2 Maccabees around 180, and it goes down to the defeat of Nicanor by Judas Maccabeus around 161 or 160. So those are the time periods the 2 books cover. Daniel 11:3, a mighty king will stand up. Who is this? Alexander the Great. First Maccabees, chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. Alexander of Macedon, son of Philip, and so forth. And that would cover the years 336. This is new. I didn't give this with the outline last time. I'm going to give you dates for each of these now. 336 through 323. The extent of the rule of Alexander. 336 through 323. Okay, then we said Daniel 11:4 through 19. Daniel 11:4 through 19 corresponds with 1 Maccabees 1:5 through 9. Okay, just take a moment to look at that. Look through Daniel. We're talking about Daniel 11, verse 4, division of Alexander's kingdom, and the rise and the supremacy of the kings of the north and south, verse 5, 6, 7, 8. Down to verse 10, the time of Antiochus III the Great, all the way through verse 19, the end of the rule of Antiochus III the Great. Okay, then look in 1 Maccabees 1, verses 5 through 9. Alexander's death comes, although the truth of the matter is not told here. The kingdom wasn't divided while Alexander was still alive, but after his death. But look at this last phrase in verse 9. That is a summary of all we've studied from Daniel 11:4 through 19. They brought untold miseries upon the world. Who were they? The successors to Alexander the Great. That's covered, what we've covered all in Daniel 11 through 14. They brought untold miseries upon the world. Okay, chronologically that would go from 323, the date of the death of Alexander, 323, through the end of the reign of Antiochus the Great. Remember that off the top of your head? 187. 187. It's the beginning of the reign of his son, Seleucus IV. Okay, then Daniel 11 and verse 20. Just as one verse, Daniel 11 and verse 20. Speaks of the raiser of taxes, Seleucus IV, and the envoy he sends out, Heliodorus. That corresponds with the whole third chapter of 2 Maccabees. Because it's all piecemeal like this, we have to give it to you in some outline form, because it is just piecemeal. We're going now in order through Daniel 11. We gave it to you in order both ways, but in order through Daniel 11, and then you'll see it's not so much in order with all of the accounts of Maccabees. Now, since we know that Seleucus IV is on the throne from 187 to 175, that'd be the general date then of verse 20, somewhere between 187 and 175. Now, excluding the two letters that introduce and open the book of 2 Maccabees, which take up all of the first two chapters, the historical material doesn't begin until chapter 3 in 2 Maccabees. Consequently, if I told you the date of the material for 2 Maccabees would be from 180 to 161, then probably the event of Heliodorus coming and trying to take the treasures of the temple would take place right in the middle of the reign of Seleucus IV, which would be around 180. We just say in general somewhere between 187 and 175, but it's probably very close to being 180 BC for Daniel 11:20, and therefore for 2 Maccabees chapter 3. Okay, then Daniel 11:21 through 31. All of this dealing with Epiphanes. Daniel 11:21 through 31. Corresponds, first of all, with 1 Maccabees 1:10 through 64. Let's go back to this book and look. 1 Maccabees 1:10 through 64. See, we're going in order through Daniel, and it ends up more or less being in order through these books as long as you jump back and forth between the two of them. Once you're in each book individually, then we're going in order. Okay, Alexander was 1 to 4. His successors were 5 through 9. And the chief of those successors, Epiphanes, starts in verse 10. A scion of this stock was that wicked man Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus III the Great. And all about him goes from there all the way to the end of that chapter. The divine wrath raged against Israel. Verse 64. The last verse of 1 Maccabees 1. Well, he comes to the throne in 175. So that'd be the beginning date here for Daniel 11:21 to 31 and 1 Maccabees 1:10 through 64. And then for an end date, look what we have in Daniel 11:31. This helps us date the end. Arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice. They shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. We know that happened in the middle of December in 168. So the date then would be, what we're studying here in Daniel 11:21 to 31, covers a very, very brief time in history, from 175 to 168. And this portion of Daniel 11:21 to 31, also corresponds with 2 Maccabees, chapters 4 and 5. Let's go over and look at that and remind ourselves of the topics. 2 Maccabees, chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4 concerns a rivalry in the high priesthood. Starts with Onias. We talked about that earlier already tonight. He's outbidded by Jason, who is in turn outbidded by Menelaus. That's chapter 4. That's all of chapter 4. Chapter 5, we're talking about the entering into Jerusalem of Antiochus after his second invasion of Egypt. Notice the first verse there. About this time, Antiochus undertook his second invasion of Egypt. Tonight we just discussed the first invasion that ends in the Battle of Pelusium in 170. The second invasion takes place in 168. So 2 Maccabees 4 through 5, we would date 174 through 168. The events are spread out in history from 174 to 168. Okay, then that leaves us with this final section in Daniel 11, verses 32 through 35. Daniel 11, 32 through 35. Notice we haven't thus far covered very much material in the books of Maccabees. Just the first chapter of 1 Maccabees and just chapters 3, 4, and 5 in 2 Maccabees. Well, what are the books of Maccabees about? The revolt of the Maccabees against the Syrians. Therefore, that must be the topic then of Daniel 11, 32 through 35, when the Jews finally revolt against this tremendous spirit of Hellenism that's being spread in the country. That's what takes up the whole books of the Maccabees, basically the entire books. So then that would correspond, verses 32 through 35, with 1 Maccabees chapter 2 and verse 1, through chapter 9 and verse 22. And 2 Maccabees chapters 6 through 15, the end of the book. Now 1 Maccabees goes quite a bit past chapter 9 and verse 22. But that's the death of the first of the brothers, Judas. Judas Maccabeus was the most important of the brothers. He dies after the battle of Nicanor, with Nicanor, 161, around 160. And that seems to be what the thrust of the material concerning Jewish revolt in Daniel 11, i.e. verses 32 through 35, are concerned with. Therefore, they'd have to come to an end with the death of Judas Maccabeus and not go on into Simon and Jonathan and all the way down to John Hyrcanus. So both of those sections, 1 Maccabees 2 through 9, 2 Maccabees 6 through 15, date 168 to around 160. Now, let me just sum all of that up concerning each of the books of Maccabees. Here's what we're going to be looking at. 1 Maccabees 1:10 through 9:22 cover the years 175 through 160. And cover the verses in Daniel from Daniel 11:21 through Daniel 11:35. Then for 2 Maccabees, concerning our studies here in Daniel 11 and the intertestamental period, we're concerned with chapter 4 through chapter 15. Which would cover approximately 175 down to 160. Or you could say 174, since we know it's a year after Epiphanes comes to the throne that Onias is deposed from the high priesthood. I've got a wrong date down here on my notes, so I'm glad I know what I'm talking about, or I'd read you the wrong thing here. I got 180, but that's back to the very beginning. That would have to include chapter 3. But chapter 4 through chapter 15 would be around 175, 174, down to 160. Okay, do you have any questions on anything tonight? I'll be glad to go over something if I need to rehearse something in your ears, as long as it's not too long.
What was the verses in Maccabees 4:15?
2 Maccabees, chapter 4 through chapter 15.
Okay, that's what I mean.
Chapter 4 through chapter 15, covering 174 to 160, 14-year period. All this is fairly important to know. We've looked at a lot of this material, whenever we studied 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and thus far in Daniel 11, we've already gone back to some of this. But there's a lot more that we're going to look at. As a matter of fact, there's one more section that we do want to look at before I close tonight that corresponds with this section we've dealt with here in Daniel 11. That's one thing we have thus far not done. Remember what we looked at basically tonight is this battle of Pelusium, the first invasion of Egypt. If you'll turn to 1 Maccabees, this corresponds with 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 16 through 28. See, we've already read verses 11 to 15. We've already read that, the influence of and the inroads of the spirit of Hellenism, the building of the sports stadium and all of that. We've already covered that. We've already read those verses. So we're going to be working our way through just a little bit and a little step at a time, not only through Daniel, but through these sections of the books of Maccabees as well. So verse 16, when he was firmly established on his throne, Antiochus made up his mind to become king of Egypt. 1 Maccabees 1:16. This is the first battle we're talking about here, Daniel 11:25 to 28. And so to rule over both kingdoms, he assembled a powerful force of chariots, elephants, and cavalry, and a great fleet, and invaded Egypt. When battle was joined, Ptolemy the sixth Philometor, king of Egypt, was seized with panic and took to flight, leaving many dead. You see that phrase, leaving many dead? And then look at the last part of Daniel 11:26. And many shall fall down dead. Almost exactly the same. And that's a fulfillment of it. What we're reading here in Maccabees, historically speaking, is a fulfillment of what, prophetically speaking, had been given in Daniel 11. Okay, now look at verse 20 here. On his return from the conquest of Egypt in the year 143, according to the Greek counting, which would be around 169 or 170, Antiochus marched with a strong force against Israel and Jerusalem. That's verse 28 of Daniel. His heart shall be against the Holy Covenant. In his arrogance, he entered the temple, carried off the golden altar, the lampstand with all its equipment, the table of the bread of the presence, sacred cups and bowls, golden censers, the curtain, the crowns. Stripped off all the gold plating from the temple front. He seized the silver, gold, precious vessels, and whatever secret treasures he found, and took them all with him when he left for his own country. He had caused much bloodshed and gloated over all that he had done. And great was the lamentation throughout Israel. Rulers and elders groaned in bitter grief. Girls and young men languished. The beauty of our women was disfigured. Every bridegroom took up the lament, and every bride sat grieving in her chamber. The land trembled for its inhabitants, and all the house of Jacob was wrapped in shame. So you see how, now you can begin to see how important these books of Maccabees are. Whenever you read Daniel 11:28, that his heart shall be against the Holy Covenant, then you can open up Maccabees. As long as you see, you have to know where to go in Maccabees.
Amen.
You have to know exactly where to go. Does it correspond exactly to some portion? Is it paralleled exactly in the books of Maccabees? Or is it something in Daniel that skipped over in the books of Maccabees? Or do we have something in Maccabees that was skipped over in Daniel 11? Thus, by putting the two together, we can see what's been left out in one account or the other. For instance, go to the next verse there, 2 years later. So now we're down to 168. So that must somehow then correspond with the first verse of 2 Maccabees chapter 5, where we speak about the second invasion of Epiphanes into Egypt, the first one being in 170, the second one being 2 years later. The second one we'll get to down there in verses 29 and 30, whenever he makes another attempt against Egypt. And that basically, you see, is all we can study thus far, because the large section of the book are going to come in with verses 32 through 35 in Daniel and the fighting back of the Maccabees. Of course, we can't probably take the time to read all of that material then, but you can see where all of that material will properly fit.